The black Mercedes pulled to a stop at the red light, and that's when Richard saw them. A young woman huddled under the bridge with a small child wrapped in her arms, both of them shivering in the cold morning air. Their clothes were torn and dirty. The little boy couldn't have been more than 4 years old. Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The light turned green, but he didn't move. The car behind him honked. He didn't care. Something about the way that mother held her son, protecting him from a world that had clearly given up on them both, made Richard's chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. Before we continue with this incredible story, if you love hearing about real acts of kindness that restore your faith in humanity, please subscribe to Sage Stories and hit that like button. We share these powerful stories every week, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now let's find out what happened next. Richard Morrison had everything money could buy. The 52-year-old tech entrepreneur lived in a mansion in the hills, overlooking the city, drove luxury cars, and wore watches that cost more than most people's homes. He'd built his software company from nothing, and when he sold it 5 years ago, the 8-figure payout set him up for life. But lately something had been gnawing at him. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier from cancer, and his 2 grown children lived on opposite coasts, too busy with their own lives to visit much. The big house felt empty. The money felt meaningless. He'd been driving to his downtown office that Tuesday morning out of habit more than necessity. But now, sitting at that traffic light, Richard couldn't stop staring at the mother and child. The light cycled through green again, and again he didn't move. Cars swerved around him, honking and shouting. Finally, he pulled over to the side of the road, his heart pounding. He'd passed homeless people 1,000 times in this city. Why was this different? Maybe it was the way the little boy looked up at his mother with complete trust, even though she clearly had nothing to give him. Maybe it was because Richard's own mother had struggled to raise him alone after his father left, and he remembered too well what it felt like to be hungry and scared. He got out of the car and walked toward them. The woman noticed him approaching and instinctively pulled her son closer. Her eyes were guarded, tired, but there was a fierce protectiveness in them that reminded Richard of a lioness defending her cub. He stopped a respectful distance away and knelt down so he wouldn't tower over them. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said gently. "My name is Richard. I just wanted to make sure you and your son are okay. Can I help you with anything? Maybe get you some breakfast?" The woman stared at him for a long moment, clearly trying to decide if she could trust him. Her name was Sarah, and she was only 28 years old, though the streets had aged her beyond her years. She'd been living under this bridge for 3 weeks with her son Marcus. Before that, they'd been in her car until it was repossessed. Before that, a terrible sequence of bad luck, a sudden layoff, an eviction, a failed attempt to stay with family who had their own problems. The world had a way of kicking people when they were already down. "We're fine," Sarah said quietly, but her voice cracked slightly on the words. Marcus was staring at Richard with huge brown eyes, and Richard noticed the boy's lips had a slight blue tint from the cold. "Please," Richard said. "There's a diner just 2 blocks from here. Just let me buy you both a warm meal. No strings attached. I promise." Something in his voice, or maybe just the desperate hunger gnawing at her stomach, made Sarah nod. They walked to the diner together, Richard keeping his distance to make sure she felt safe. Inside the warm restaurant, he watched as Sarah and Marcus devoured plates of pancakes, eggs, and bacon. Marcus giggled when the syrup dripped down his chin, and Sarah smiled. A real smile that transformed her entire face. Richard ordered more food for them to take with them, and asked the waitress to add some extra portions. While they ate, Sarah told him her story. How she'd been a dental assistant before the practice closed down unexpectedly. How her parents had passed away in a car accident 2 years ago. How Marcus's father had left before the boy was even born. How she'd tried everything. Shelters were full. Waiting lists for assistants stretched for months. And every job she applied for wanted an address she didn't have. She'd been stuck in an impossible cycle. And the harder she tried to climb out, the deeper she seemed to fall. "I'm not looking for charity," Sarah said, her pride still intact despite everything. "I'm a hard worker. I just need a chance." Richard listened to every word, and something shifted inside him. He'd spent the last few years feeling purposeless, wondering what all his success was even for. Here was someone who wanted nothing more than the opportunity to work, to provide for her child, to have basic dignity, And here he was with more resources than he could ever use. "What if I could help you get back on your feet?" he asked carefully. "Not charity, an opportunity. Would you be interested?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I don't understand. Why would you help us? You don't even know us." Richard thought about his own mother, working 3 jobs to keep him fed and in school. He thought about his late wife, who'd always volunteered at homeless shelters and food banks, telling him that kindness was the only currency that really mattered. He thought about how empty his life had felt lately, how disconnected from anything real or meaningful. "Let's just say I know what it's like to need help," he said, "and I'm in a position to give it." That day, Richard did something he'd never done before. He called his attorney and his accountant and set things in motion. Within a week, Sarah and Marcus were living in a small but clean apartment that Richard owned and had been sitting empty. He didn't just hand her money, he connected her with a dental office run by a friend who was looking for an experienced assistant. Sarah started working, and Richard arranged for Marcus to attend a good daycare nearby. He covered the first 3 months of rent and childcare, giving Sarah time to get her first paychecks and start saving. But Richard didn't stop there. Helping Sarah had awakened something in him. He started volunteering at the shelter downtown, talking to people, hearing their stories. He used his business expertise to help some of them write resumes and prepare for job interviews. He created a small fund to help people with those impossible gaps: the first month's rent, the work clothes for an interview, the car repair that meant the difference between keeping and losing a job. 6 months later, Sarah invited Richard to Marcus's 5th birthday party in their apartment. She decorated with handmade streamers and balloons. The cake was simple, but Marcus's face glowed with joy. Sarah had saved enough to buy her son a bicycle, and Richard watched as the little boy rode it in. Circles in the apartment complex, parking lot, squealing with delight. "I got my first paycheck this week where I didn't have to give most of it to catch up on bills," Sarah told Richard. "I opened a savings account. It's not much, but it's mine, Marcus's and mine." "That's incredible," Richard said, and he meant it. Watching Sarah's transformation had been more rewarding than any business deal he'd ever closed. She stood taller now. The fear had left her eyes, replaced by hope and determination. "I can never repay you for what you did," Sarah said. "You don't need to repay me," Richard replied. "Just promise me something. When you're stable and successful, and you will be, promise me you'll help someone else who needs it. Not because you owe me, but because you remember what it felt like to need help." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I promise. I'll never forget." Richard drove home that night, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: purpose, joy, connection. He'd spent so much of his life chasing success, building wealth, achieving goals. But this, helping Sarah and Marcus, seeing them thrive, knowing he'd made a real difference in their lives. This felt like the most important thing he'd ever done. The truth is, kindness doesn't cost nearly as much as we think it does. Sometimes it's just stopping when everyone else drives by. Sometimes it's listening to someone's story instead of making assumptions. Sometimes it's offering not just money, but dignity, respect, and a real opportunity. Richard had millions in the bank, but what he gave Sarah wasn't really about the money. It was about seeing her as a human being who deserved a chance, about believing in her when the world had stopped believing, about extending a hand instead of turning away. Today, Sarah manages the dental office where she works. Marcus is thriving in 2nd grade. And Richard? He's busier now than when he was running his company. But it's a different kind of busy. He's changed dozens of lives through his foundation, helping people bridge that gap between homelessness and stability. His house doesn't feel empty anymore, because it's filled with purpose. The next time you see someone struggling, remember that you have the power to change their story. You don't need millions of dollars. You just need to see people as people, to stop when others drive by, to offer help without judgment. The world becomes a better place one act of kindness at a time. One connection at a time, one person choosing to care when it would be easier not to. What small act of kindness could you do today? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let's inspire each other to make a difference.